I have a video that I'm going to be DPing soon, so I'm trying to figure out which camera to use for it. I'm going to be shooting the whole thing in 1080p, so I need a good 1080p camera, and I have two of them, which is the A7IV that's recording me right now, and I also have a Sony FS5 that's an amazing 1080p camera. So I thought, why don't I do a comparison video between these two cameras and see how they perform. So first we're going to do a quick 4K test just to see what the 4K resolution looks like compared to this camera versus this camera. That's going to be a little complicated to do because the A7IV is a full frame camera while the FS5 is a Super 35 camera. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to do a full frame test, see how that compares to the Super 35 of this camera, but then I'm going to put the A7IV into Super 35 mode also, just so we can see, we can have like a more direct comparison between these two cameras. So let's do that right now. Alright, we got a lot of information, so try to pay attention. We're going to try to do this really fast, but we're shooting with the A7IV first in the Super 35 mode at 50mm. Pay attention to that, because right after this scene right here, we're going to switch over to full frame where we have to use 75mm to get the same framing. So when you switch between, full frame and Super 35 mode, you do have to change your focal length to get the same, framing. And as you can see in both modes, the camera is really sharp, but the thing that I did notice is that when you shoot full frame, the image is cleaner than Super 35 mode. Now we're shooting with the FS5 and we're going to be comparing the S-Log3 versus the S-Log2 of this camera. As you can see, there's a little bit of differences. First of all, we're shooting at 2000 ISO because that's the base ISO of this camera. But as you can see, this camera is not as sharp as the A7IV and it's a lot noisier. Mainly because of that 2000 ISO, it just doesn't give you that clean of an image. But here we're shooting at S-Log2 right now, and as you can see, the S-Log2 is a little bit cleaner, but that's because with the S-Log3 of this camera, it doesn't really work that well because we have an 8-bit footage instead of the 10-bit out of the A7IV. Now, when we compare both of these cameras in 4K resolution, as you can see, A7IV is a lot sharper and cleaner than the FS5. That's one of the biggest problems with the FS5 is that the sharpness is okay on the camera, but you do get very noisy footage with this camera even when you expose it right. And exposing this camera is also a little bit of a nightmare when you're shooting an S-Log. While with the A7IV you can just expose it to whatever looks right on your eyes, but with the FS5 and some of the older Sony A7 cameras, you have to overexpose the image by a stop and a half. But both of these cameras do give you great footage, so I wouldn't say one is bad or good. It's just that the A7IV does give you a sharper and cleaner image out of it, and if you're shooting an S-Log, A7IV does have more flexibility in post-production compared to the FS5 because the A7IV can shoot in 4K 10-bit, while the FS5 is limited to 8 bits. But what about the 1080p footage of the A7IV versus the FS5? And both of these cameras actually shoot in 1080p 10-bit resolution, so they should be similar. So we're going to be recording both of these cameras in S-Log3, even though from my experience of using these cameras, the S-Log2 works better on the FS5. Even though it's a 10-bit image that you get out of it, it seems to work better, but for these purposes, we're going to be using S-Log3. Let's see how the image looks when you mix the footages from both of these cameras. So let's do a test, and we're going to be shooting in 1080p, 24 frames per second. Later on, we're going to try out the slow motion modes of these cameras because both of them actually have very different slow motion features. So let's do the 24 frames per second test right now. Now we're shooting at A7IV full frame, 24 frames per second. As you can see, we get a really nice, clean, and also a really sharp image also out of it. Now when we change into the Super 35 mode, this is going to be our focal length, and we're switching into it just to show you guys, what it looks like and how it compares to the FS5, because FS5 again is Super 35 only. And here's the Sony FS5, and as you can see, the color science is a little different from the A7IV. With the A7IV you get a very clean and accurate colors, but with the FS5, as you can see, you have a little bit of blue tinge towards the whites of the image. That's because there's a little bit of color cast coming to the whites, but honestly I don't mind it because it gives it more of a cinematic feel than the A7IV, so I like the shot better. Now let's compare the skin tones between these two cameras, and right here we got the A7IV, and as you can see again, we get a really nice sharp clean image out of this camera. Here, let me zoom in, and as you can see, and now I have the autofocus on both of these shots, so right here as you can see, A7IV is perfectly keeping me in focus, and everything looks great. Now when we go to FS5, it honestly looks very similar to it. As you can see, the autofocus is struggling a little bit because we're gonna get to the autofocus in a bit, but the thing is that the image quality looks very similar out of both of these cameras. Now let's zoom into both of these shots and let's see how it looks. And as you can see, A7IV it's like significantly sharper and cleaner again, but honestly it's not a huge difference. If you were to mix footage between these two cameras, if you had them one set as A cam, other one as B cam, honestly no one's really going to be able to tell the difference. So when you're shooting in 1080p, honestly these both cameras actually match really well, especially since both of them can shoot in 1080p 10-bit. But the thing is, if you have to shoot in 4K, then it does get a little bit more complicated, since one has 8-bit footage out of it and the other one has 10-bit footage. So, but if you're shooting 1080p, it's perfectly fine to combine these two cameras, which probably means that for my next project, I'm just going to be using both these cameras for different situations. As you can see, both of these cameras, you can get great image quality out of both of them. You can get cinematic looking footage out of both of these cameras, especially look at this shot with the FS5. I mean, this is like almost a 10-year-old camera, and you can get such amazing footage out of it when you shoot in 1080p 10-bit resolution. But now let's take a look at the autofocus performance, because this is where you really see the difference that happened in these past 10 years with Sony. And right here, as you can see, we have the A7IV, which arguably has the best autofocus ever in any camera ever, and as you can see, it does such an amazing job of just keeping my face in track. Like, as you can see, I get out of frame and come out, it just perfectly grabs me. And right here I'm going to change the autofocusing speed, because before I was on the fastest setting, so it was just keeping me constantly in track, and now I have it on the slowest version. As you can see, now it does a slow focus pull when you get out of frame, and when you come back into the frame, it just slowly focuses on you. So it just gives you like so many different options when you're trying to focus with it. Now when we go to the FS5, as you can see, I actually had to manual focus there to get myself in focus, so that the camera would somewhat keep me in focus, because the camera has a really hard time in that initial focus. But as you can see, once it does get you in focus, it does a decent job of holding you in focus. But the main problem with the FS5 is that it uses the older contrast detect based autofocus. So with the newer cameras, they use the phase detect autofocus, which means that if it finds you in focus, it just keeps you perfectly in focus. While with contrast detect autofocus, the camera has to constantly focus back and forth in order to keep you in focus. That's why people constantly complain about the Panasonic cameras, because they refuse to get phase detect for some reason. But that's the same problem with the FS5, is that you use contrast detect autofocus. And as you can see, when I leave the frame, it doesn't even try to like get another thing in focus. It just stays there, and it has a really hard time getting me in focus. And when it does get me in focus, it just constantly goes back and forth. So I mean, the autofocus is somewhat usable, but honestly, you'll be better off using manual focus with this camera. And as you can see here, it can't even like find me. As you can see, once it loses focus, it can't get it back. So when it comes to the slow motion features of the camera, they actually do the slow motion very differently. With the A7IV, it does it in a traditional sense. Like right now, I'm shooting at 1080p, 120 frames per second, and I can just slow this down like how I'm doing. And you can record audio with it, but you can only do this at 8-bit codec. If you want to do 10-bit, you can only do it up to 1080p 60 frames per second, which is the same with the Sony FS5. Both of these cameras can do 10-bit 1080p up to 60 frames per second, which is a lot of people don't know about this camera, because people think that, oh, it can do 120 frames per second, but it can only do it in 8-bit. If you want to do 10-bit 120 frames per second, you have to use the slow and quick mode, which doesn't have any audio with it. So it's a different mode that you have to use. But the different thing that Sony FS5 does that a lot of other cameras don't is that it has a trigger mode. So what the trigger mode allows with the camera is that what you can do with this camera, which is super useful when you're shooting wildlife, because what the Sony FS5 does is that, besides in the traditional sense of you just start recording and then record whatever you want and then you slow it down post-production, what this camera does is that it records the last either 4 or 8 seconds, you choose however much you want to do. and you pretty much press record, and when you press record, it records the last 4 or 8 seconds, and then it slows it down within the camera. So this is very important, because what this allows you to do is, let's say you're doing a wildlife video or something, what you can do is you can just look through your viewfinder until you see something interesting happen, and when something interesting does happen, then you just press record and you have the last 4 to 8 seconds recorded. This is a mode that I absolutely love about this camera, but for some reason they never put it to any other camera. They put it into some of their bridge cams or their smaller cameras, but they never put it again to their professional cameras for some reason. I don't know why. If you buy yourself like a Sony FX6 or FX9 or whatever, those cameras don't have this feature, which is one of the reasons why I haven't even upgraded from this camera, because that's a feature that I absolutely love. We already know that Sony A7IV can do 4K 60 frames per second, and 1080p can do up to 120 frames per second. Well, with this camera, with 4K, you're limited to 30 frames per second, unless if you shoot externally. There's a lot of wind going on, so you might not be able to hear me. But with 4K, you're limited to 30 frames per second, unless if you shoot external, then you can shoot up to 120 frames per second. But internally with the camera, when you're shooting HD, you can shoot up to 60 frames per second with sound. But if you just get rid of sound and you just use the slow motion mode with that trigger mode, you can go up to 960 frames per second. And the image quality doesn't look good, but the fact that you can do it is quite amazing. So let's take a look at some of the footage that shot with this camera in 240p, 480p, and 960p. First off, we're going to start out with the A7IV with its 4K 60 frames per second. And as you can see, the image quality straight out of camera looks amazing, and when you slow it down 60 frames per second, as you can see, you get a pretty nice slow motion video with it. Again, 60 frames isn't like super slow motion, you don't get that much of a slow motion effect to it, but it's still nice. And as you can see, we can zoom in even 250%, and we still get a really nice sharp and crisp image, which is what I love about the 4K of this camera. Now when we switch to 1080p full frame, as you can see, with full frame, we can barely get close to the animals. They're really far away. That's why when I'm using this camera, even if I'm shooting in 1080p and I'm trying to do wildlife videography, I usually use the Super 35 mode. Right here I switched into the Super 35 mode, and as you can see, it's still the same exact image quality, but now we're a lot closer to the animals, which is quite amazing. And this is a way better way of doing things than if you were to just zoom into it in post-production. It's not gonna look as nice. So Super 35 mode and video mode is super important with this camera, and as you can see, with 120 frames per second, you can get decent slow motion. Now we're up to the FS5, and I'm not putting the resolution down because it just says 1080p for all of them, but definitely doesn't stay 1080p. But right now we're shooting at 128 frames per second, and that's the fastest you can do for the slow and quick mode. And as you can see, I would say this is 1080p. It looks pretty decent. And again, we're using the trigger mode, which I absolutely love, because you can just wait for that right moment, and then as you can see, I just saw a bird coming, so I pressed the trigger a couple of seconds after, and I know that I got that shot. So I absolutely love the trigger mode. So now let's go to the 240 frames per second. Now at the 240 frames per second, it still almost looks 1080p, maybe 720p, but it's still a very good looking usable footage. So as you can see, we can get some detail on the bird's wings now, which is amazing. Again, I got a bird pushing another bird because I have that trigger mode, so I know I can just wait around and then just press the button whenever I see something cool happen. I wish the A7IV also had 240 frames per second, because it can definitely do it. If the FS5 could do it 10 years ago, the A7IV can definitely do it, but they probably just didn't want to do it, so they wouldn't, cannibalize the A7S III. Now let's take a look at the 480 frames per second, and as you can see, the resolution definitely starts dropping, but it's still decent looking, usable footage. I would definitely still use the 480 frames per second, but it's decent looking footage. You get really good slow motion with it. But now let's take a look at the 960 frames per second. And now we're at 960 frames per second, and as you can see, the image quality is pretty bad, but it's still really cool because you're able to shoot pretty much 1000 frames per second. So you get so much detail when you have fast moving subjects like these birds right here. You can see their wings moving, and it's quite amazing what you can do. I wish Sony would bring back this mode. I don't know why they haven't. Again, they had this technology 10 years ago, so why haven't they worked on it, developed it, and made it look better? Imagine if they did this with like actual 1080p footage. Like it would be amazing with the newer cameras we have. And I get it if they don't want to put it on their like lower end bodies, but put it on like the A1 or something, or put it on the Sony FX9 or something. You know, I think this is a really cool mode that they completely got rid of for some reason. But anyways, you can still do it on the FS5. It just looks terrible. Anyways guys, there's a million different things we can talk about, and if you have any questions specifically about either of these cameras, make sure to let me know in the comment section video. If it's interesting enough, I might make a video about it. But anyways, this video is becoming too long, so I mean, both of these cameras are great, but honestly nowadays if you ask me which one to get, it really depends on what your situation. But for most situations, I think the A7IV is just a lot better camera. I mean, it's newer, but both these cameras are the same price, so it does make it a little bit more difficult. But I think just when it comes to the raw specs you get out of the camera, A7IV is a lot better. But depending on what you might need, FS5 might be a better camera. It's kind of comparing apples and oranges. One's like a, you know, professional cinema camera, while the other one's a hybrid camera. But anyways guys, thanks for watching this video. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section below. Again, it's kind of hard to determine which one's a better camera, you know, because they do so many different things differently. But depending on what you want to do, just let me know in the comment section below and I'll try to help you. But anyways guys, thanks for watching this video. If you watched all the way to the end, thanks so much. I know it's a very long video, but I make videos every single week, so make sure to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.